got there yet, and like so we didn't even have the words in common to talk about it.
squad wealth and all them things. You know, some of those simple keywords which we kind of all can get behind and understand in a simplistic way. I think in cryptocurrency we have an actual issue with jargon. Like
Hmm.
we have a lot of jargon, and I think that's actually one of the main hindrances in regards to adoption. Like when I speak to, I don't know if you call them like normies or my friends and stuff like that, or even my family members, and you're trying to explain, oh, this is what a DAO is, this is what this is, this is what that is, and they're all great words, but they do not allow for a
Me,
simplistic viewing and
yeah.
understanding of what it actually is, because it's not overly complicated. I don't think it is that complicated, but explaining it to people within the words that we naturally use or we use often in the crypto space is actually a bit of an
Right.
issue. Yeah,
Well, it's counterproductive, literally, because you start using those words and people's eyes glaze over and they're like, "Oh, I don't know what you're talking about. It
for
sounds
sure,
sketchy."
for sure.
Whereas if you, again, like the hard
The
work is
hard
to
work.
recognize how much of this is not new, and this is like where I often tell people, like, there's good, historical work, not just
Yeah,
there's some nonfiction, even some science fiction is great. Like if you go read this book, it's called The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin,
okay.
and like it's from, I don't know, the 70s maybe. She's a great science fiction writer, and you like learn about this like world that part of the story takes place in, and it's a like it is remarkable how many parallels there are to sort of the DAO space, and you realize that like actually what we're talking about is human coordination phenomena that have existed forever, but they change forms. It depends on the context, the communities, what those communities are trying to accomplish, what they're trying to get away from, what
Yeah,
new tools are at their disposal, how do they use those tools, what like. But at the end of the day, it's really just like people using concepts, ideas, and tools to organize themselves around some shared
yeah,
desire. And
yeah,
there's always this weird tension between the people who sort of want to, what I'll call, like, change the system or like identify ways to make it better,
hmm,
and people who want to view it as it is, and keep it the same, so like
yeah,
kind of change forces and sameness forces. And the reason I bring that up is because it happens even in crypto, even within a DAO. You'll find the people saying like, no, we decided this, we have to stick to it. At
yeah,
the same time, the other people are going, no, it's really not getting us what we said we were trying to accomplish, let's try to change it. And like those two groups, even within an otherwise aligned community, are still going to be debating with each other. And that's not bad. You just have to remember that that's actually just part of human organization. You
yeah,
can't, like, no amount of technology is going to remove that, like, fundamental
yeah,
tension between let's, evaluate the thing and change it, and no, it's good, keep it the same, because it's the interaction effect between those two
hmm,
things that actually steers the group.
for sure, for sure. I think that was one of the things that I think that has also come up before in regards to even the perspective of what metagame is. And the thing is, in the past we have players and people who contribute to the community, and they had maybe a year or 2 years ago was this, that, and the other, and then this thing is now grown to something totally different, and now the newer participants have a totally different perspective, and they want to push things in maybe a slightly different direction. And like you mentioned there was almost, or there is that tug of war between, okay, well, what is the real um, ideals? What are the real what's the real direction we're meant to go in as a community? And one thing I found really useful was almost to kind of go back and look at the original frame and perspective which Pep put together in regards to his like initial Medium posts and things like that, to kind of get an idea of what he thought metagame should be from a day one perspective compared to what it is today. And from that framework, I feel like we ended up learning that um, some of the terminology and some of the parts of metagame we thought would be of great interest aren't really that inspiring. For instance, um, calling metagame like the onboarding machine for Ethereum. It's like, okay, cool, you're an onboarding machine. Who the hell actually wants to, join an onboarding machine? We want to join a cool community. We want to join a place where it's fun to be a part of. There's things going on, this, that, and the other. And because me, I'm a part of the shillers.
That's a narrative gap too, though, because you also don't understand the difference between description as function relative to a larger whole from something that's actually, okay, so what I'm saying is that description makes sense in a very, let's say, very technical, like, what is the potential? I'm not even saying it should be this, but the proposit was that the relationship between metagame and the rest of the sort of Web3 ecology would be, hey, this is fun and accessible, and someone can come in and hang out and do stuff and read cool media and build some identity through collaboration, through participation, yada yada. Like, in a very real way, that can function as an onboarding machine, but you wouldn't pitch it. Your narrative isn't, we're the onboarding machine. The narrative is, this is fun and legible, and it's easy to get involved, and people will help you and take care of you. It's the more general notion of the innkeeper, like the innkeeper zoomed out as organization, as community, which is fine and cool and interesting, but that's a way of describing what role you might hope to fulfill in the larger ecosystem. So this actually brings me to a point that I didn't think I was going to talk about, but I think is super relevant. I pretty much always think about an organization as being both in some broader context and made up of some smaller, component context. So we talked about drilling down into metagame and thinking about the stakeholders and the value flows and the functions required to accomplish metagame's goals. But what you kind of brought up with this onboarding machine thing is how metagame sees itself as being part, or how it is a part of the broader ecology. And this can come in the form of these various, DAO-to-DAO sort of integrations and partnerships, but it can also be really just saying, in Web3 at large, what is metagame relative to that bigger context. And so I think that the onboarding machine thing is a conjecture rather than this is the truth, but it's a sort of way of orienting yourself, and you don't have to use it as the narrative for it to still be useful for thinking about what you're trying to accomplish.
Agreed. I think that illustrates exactly, I think, some of my thoughts surrounding it and other people's thoughts surrounding it. It's like, functionally it can act like this, but I wouldn't that exactly, because it's not particularly engaging for most people or any new entrant into a new space.
Calling it that is like, it is absurd in the literal sense. Like, if you were to call it the onboarding machine, it would, by virtue of that, be a worse onboarding machine.
I wouldn't join. Like, I actually wouldn't join. I think that's something I I'm not joining.
Exactly.
That's not me being an arsehole. It's just like, I don't want to join the onboarding machine with all the other people that don't know anything. Like, I kind of like engaging in a community where you have all these various different levels of expertise and domain level expertise, and we all kind of congregate around this fire, and we share ideas, and we just chat, and we get great ideas from it. And that has been something I've really experienced as a part of like metagame as a whole, and I think that's more something to hone into, not the fact that you're a new person and this way you should join.
Here's an interesting analogy for you, since I know this. We've had the sort of role-playing game, video game analogy. Imagine that you're coming into the big city in the video game, where they have all the profession trainers and all the skill trainers and all the portals to the other places and lots of NPCs to send you places, and lots of other players are around to build parties and go do stuff, and quests available for you to go do. It's like, it's a hub. It is, in a sense, the right place to onboard through, but on the other hand, it's a lot more than that, and that reducing it to that is sort of gonna turn people off. But you can sort of make it into the the hearth in a meaningful sense if you make it easy for people when they get there to find experts who are willing to teach, experts who want to go do raids, do quests,
Yeah.
find quests, find like onboarding isn't about like, hey, you're a noob. Onboarding is about sorting. It's about ease of self-service and sorting. It's about the availability of people to help you who are at the same level as you, or people who are a little bit above you who are able to impart knowledge. It's like really that that sort of nexus that you were trying to create with this, and at least again my projection. But I think again, really trying to understand that might start with saying something like, well, what would it mean to be a good onboarding machine? Isn't again not the same as saying, well, we're the onboarding machine.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. I think, yeah, it just speaks to some of the thoughts that have kind of floated around this, but it's good to hear it from your perspective as well. Um, it's hard for me to figure out what else there is to say other than because you've really spoken and talked on various different aspects, which I feel we need to kind of just meet, and now it's a case of us taking the action to completing the rest of those things. And I guess what's probably most interesting is we do have some proposals that will be shared within the next day or so regarding some low-hanging fruit of our tokenomics. So like I said previously, Reflexa Labs and also Babylon Finance in regards to some of our asset management and stuff. And I kind of see those as potential to buy us a bit of time while we figure out this lending market for the seeds so that we can support people's lives and provide more access to opportunity. Like we have players, we have, I'm not sure, I'm pretty sure it'd be okay with me telling this story, but Miss Amp, who is on this call, previous to Metagame, he would work seasonally on ships and on boats
Okay.
in his home country. He comes to Metagame around all these great various different types of individuals, and even a case of Boogie here, who's also on the call. He teaches Miss Amp how to use Blender, obviously like this 3D tool where you can create these amazing animations and graphics, and he's like like got this information and has ran with it and has produced so much great work from that instance. And what I kind of see Metagame as is providing more of these opportunities for more people just like Miss Amp. These are people who are prepared to work, they're prepared to learn, and they're open to learning. They just don't know that this space exists yet. And
Yeah.
when it comes to onboarding in particular, it's like, okay, well, we've been doing in the Schiller's Guild a lot on target audience. We've been doing personas to try and nail down what people's drives are, hesitations, pain points, so we can look to address them at the community level so that we can keep people like Miss Amp who exist across the world to become engaged and kind of express their value in a way which is conducive to the betterment of like humanity. That's like the big altruistic like idea.
Yeah, but it doesn't. It's not. It's just funny because people make in our current cultural framework that's treated as like somehow like revolutionary. But I would argue that it's sort of absurd that that's revolutionary
Yeah.
because, in my opinion, that's like that is what economy is.
Yep.
Economy is people doing stuff, teaching each other stuff, making stuff. Like the idea of like high finance as economics is mind numbing. It's like it's all like derivatives of derivatives of derivatives. Like the first order notion of economy is literally just people doing stuff.
Yeah.
And like the fact that that's lost is like really frustrating. And so I appreciate the goal, but I also think that some of what's missing is an understanding that that is economy.
Yeah.
This other stuff with like the derivatives of derivatives and lending and tokens and like that stuff is sure it is useful. It
Yeah.
creates it creates liquidity. It enables flows. It allows us in some ways to have a place where say the value that Miss Anth creates can be, consumed somewhere else, and that if money flows somewhere, it
Yeah,
flows in such a way that we can, build an organizational wrapper that can ensure that he's supported
for
in
sure.
doing that thing that, again, showed up, was interested, learned, did, value is created, and that
Yes.
that value manifests in a suitably financial way to
Right.
sustain those contributions. But like, the thing that I just drives me a little bit crazy is that, like, that's the first order economy. The
Exactly.
stuff that happens layer over layer is there in theory to support and enable that, but what we see instead is, like, higher and higher layers
Yeah.
of, you know what I it's not all extractive, but there's certainly the higher layers lend themselves to extraction and rent seeking
Yeah.
when they're not pressed into service of the, like, sort of first order economy.
For sure. For sure. Like that that in particular, I think is the main thing I care about as a part of metagame is just that. I think that's the beauty of it. I think myself in particular, I'm from the UK, went through university, went to a top school, graduated, and I ended up working like flipping burgers. Like this is how crazy it was. And a lot of people going through the pandemic have experienced, I guess, employment policies or onboarding into the career space and whatever else, which is not very favorable to them. So they're not essentially getting the value that they produce because the salaries are so low and they're not in keeping with inflation. And then um, also, we have a productivity issue within the UK. There's a lot of talk about all the productivity issues that we have, and it's like, well, all the people that kind of have the various different expertise are now working jobs what they shouldn't be working because you're not providing the opportunity or the equality of opportunity for them to express
Yeah.
their value. What the DAO space actually is or has the potential to do is allow these people to kind of jump on board and express their value. There's no assessment center. There's no this, that, and the other. It's no join.
Right.
You get what it is, and you do stuff and you do work, and we'll see how well that
Yeah.
works out for you and how that is expressed via even source cred, XP, or
it's
whatever. Right?
it's rebasing the labor markets a bit. And I think this is something, again, that goes back to my point about first order economy, is that, like, if we think about this in labor markets as sort of a rewiring or rebasing of a labor market, you realize that, yeah, the labor, we're so used to the way that they work, most
Yeah.
people, that they don't even realize that there's an alternative.
Alternatives.
There's a sort of initial, like, cut at it. If you look at the way the sort of pre-Web3 open source communities work, it was
Yeah.
possible to show up and start contributing to an open source project and, get a job at a corporation or to get some funding, but, like, it's pretty rare. Most open source software is maintained by volunteers. But it's in my opinion, it's like sort of the beginning of the track that we're on now, where we start to see, as you described, this capacity for people to sort of, do first. And, maybe a story that I can give from one of my team members, which is, I won't mention who it is, but, like, it's one of the data engineers on the Blockscience team who's worked with me for many years, including actually in a previous job. Often takes flack from some of his family members, give him some grief about the fact that he doesn't want to be bored. He wants to be learning new stuff. He's excited. He's very smart and like creates new stuff with guidance, with, obviously to fund and pay
Yeah.
his salary. Like his family, they often gives him grief because he's like, well, my goal is not to be bored. And, like, I guess the weird thing about this is they're like, well, like, that's treated as somehow being, I don't want to say, like, elitist isn't quite the right word, but,
Yeah.
like, that's his value system. Like, he's smart and capable, and he wants more than anything else to have new, exciting things to learn and try out.
Yeah.
And so he makes his decisions against that. Whereas, like, many people don't have that choice. And, my comment to him was, like, somebody in his family said, like, I don't know what the exact quote was, but something along the lines of, like, you know, that principle of not being bored is a
Yeah.
luxury. And, like, in the thing that kind of came out of that is, like, where do we really get off with an economic structure that
Uh-huh.
basically demands that people be bored, that like wedges them into little boxes and
That's
gives them
funny actually.
doesn't even give them the room to explore and grow. Like kind of flipping the conversation on its head, it's like, they feel that way because they've never experienced that optionality,
Yeah,
and that sucks for them. But it's weird to hear that, like, that they perceive it as being like, again, like, oh my God, like, almost how dare you feel
yeah,
like you can, demand to be constantly learning and trying new stuff. And it's
enjoy
kind of
it.
like, how is it gotten to the point where people can't even imagine that as an option, as opposed to like, okay, maybe let's not pretend like we're going to magically transform everything instantaneously and everyone doing every job is going to love it.
Yeah,
But the idea that that's so rare as to be considered, luxurious, because it's not like that luxurious of a job. It's
no,
not
it's
like
nothing crazy.
a fang job. It's just like you know, it's a modestly, like, we pay what we can pay for the job and give a lot of freedom for research, but also there are goals and like, hey, let's try to accomplish this. Some
Yeah,
of it's prototyping and whatnot, but my point isn't that that person's job is great. It's that the people around that person can't even understand
you
the
comprehend it.
context. They're
Yeah,
like, what do you mean you're like able to keep developing and focusing on learning new things and applying those new ideas?
yeah.
So we need to give people that optionality, and not just because of, yeah, you get the idea.
I would say like the weirdest thing about that is everybody can kind of, or most people can kind of buy into that idea. That's almost like the ideal, um, like in like a de jure sense. Like in theory, we want that, but a lot of people are so used to this current reality, the current paradigm, that in fact we ignore our what our ideals are for the reality in which it is just purely about, you know, job, money. That's it. That's it's a very transactional exchange. Whereas when we're looking at the exchanges that we have maybe in the DAO space, it's past just purely transactional in regards to like monetary value, but it's that there's more to it. It applies more to. I've been talking recently a lot about ikigai and the
Right.
ideas, surrounding like passion, vocation, etc., etc., etc. But it applies more to those types of things where it's more fulfilling, it's holistic, it's less one dimensional. And
Right.
I think that's better for humanity anyway, because we don't need to look at things from one dimension. It's just short, it's
I,
limited,
I
and
yeah, I would argue that it's problematic. It's not just like it's actually insufficient. Like, it creates problems if you try to reduce the world
yeah,
to one dimension, one measurement perspective. Particularly this financial one, you generate a lot of externalities, because
yeah,
the first principles in sort of any sort of optimization machine is that you only get what you asked for, and you don't, like, there are objectives and constraints in an optimization problem, and if you don't, if something's not your goal or it's not explicitly constrained, you will externalize that thing. And so with these sort of reductive measures, you're going to suck every other form of value out of the system in
yeah,
order to extend the one you're optimizing for. So that multi-perspectiveness is critical, not to have a sort of, again, the sort of degeneracies that we're bantering about.
yeah. Wow,
I would
agreed.
disagree. I
Ooh.
would say it for us it makes more sense, but the masses are not interested in intellectual exploration or understanding things. That's why
Ah, but it
your
doesn't have
friend.
to be about understanding. It can be phenomenological. It can be expressive. The problem is that in our current frame of reference, that's impossible. The underlying gradient is so strongly aligned with these sets of metrics now that the only way to break with that is to be overly, like, heavily intellectually engaged with it. But that's part of the sort of field of action, the field of play. So, like, right now, the field of play is so tilted in that way that there's no way to experience what we're discussing without sort of questioning. But I would argue that that's a systemic issue. If we were sufficiently, let's just say, like, measurement wise decentralized, like if the set of things that were considered valuable was richer, then people could literally just do what feels right, and they wouldn't have to be deeply engaged intellectually in this process because the field of play would be less slanted.
Okay.
Sorry. But I get your point, Penguin. I just want to be clear that I'm not saying that everyone should be hyper overanalyzing. You should be able to just vibe and not have the result of that be, sliding down this slope created by sort of a hyper financialized economy.
Right, but I'm much more like your friend. I'm here doing this because I want to understand things, make things better. And even in previous jobs, like the very first thing I would do every day is read all the articles on Hacker News, and I sought out jobs that let me explore interesting subjects. But, people have obviously we deal with much more interesting people in our sphere, but if we go to like the general case, people are like YouTube minded. They've got the goldfish single serving brain, and I think that's one of the reasons it's so hard for people to understand that the drive for intellectual need.
Yeah.
Because they want to just turn it off. They want the answer. They don't want to think.
I get you, but I can relate. But I think I'm trying to talk about something a little bit deeper than like the intellectual curiosity about like going out and learning new stuff. Let's just take for a moment, even though I actually don't think that people are quite that. I think that some of the thing that you just described is actually symptom rather than root cause. It's symptom. So maybe I'll just say like you know the concept of learned helplessness. That like if you try to do stuff that you like and you don't get any like meaningful response from your effort, that you sort of stop trying. I think that the vast majority of the copy pasta checklist sort of okay fine I did the thing mentality comes from a version of this learned helplessness, and that if you do things enough that don't matter, then eventually you learn to not. But then if you sort of zoom in, you don't need to have everyone want to read all the Hacker News articles or go learn intellectual frameworks and develop new tools. Like my friend's a researcher; he wants to be a researcher. I get that's not everyone, but I have scarcely met a person that does not have something that they're interested in, or at least were interested in doing. Everything from like sort of messing with computery stuff to just going outside and building stuff to going and like organizing like I've participated in and actually been on the board of a group that organized like recreational sports leagues and youth outreach programs, and that's all participation based volunteers because those people just that's the thing they want to be doing. And I've seen in wide range of both technical and non-technical, social, athletic, and even just like local communities, there's like an impetus to do stuff. People like doing stuff. They like doing stuff together. They don't necessarily want to learn stuff just to learn stuff, but they will want to figure out how to do the thing that they want to do. And the fact that we've, again, kind of to our discussion about the slanted field and the one side of metrics, we've basically told people that, well those things aren't valuable. And I don't think that that's true. I think that they're part of what creates, again, even in this group that you're discussing, that's part of what creates community. It's part of what creates happiness. Like, what is our actual goal? Do we want people to be, sitting in boxes, turning cranks and making more money? Or do we want them to be, able to pay their rent, buy their food, and be happy hanging, doing whatever? And it doesn't mean that every task that every person does is going to be, the greatest thing in the world and their favorite thing. But, if you go back to, have you read Venkatesh Rao's, he did this like extensive thing on the like a theory of based on The Office, and one of the things that he observed is that the quote unquote like what was the Gervais
I read that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So think about the people who are at the quote unquote bottom of that hierarchy that he doesn't necessarily treat as the bottom, the quote unquote losers. Well, what they are doing is prioritizing something else, and that in fact in many cases in that example they could be, although financially exploited, they may actually be happier, certainly, than the sociopaths, or we have our like idiot middle managers who are the risk vacuum. Like, there's something he digs at there that's pretty important, is that that's an expression of these other forms of value. You're like, yeah, okay, I'll give you what in economics we would call the minimum effort game, where you show up and you provide the minimum effort, and then you take what you need to cover your costs, and then you spend your time and energy and your attention on something that you care about. That's still an expression of the same conversation, and it does not require those people to be wanting to engage on a deep intellectual level. It really just requires them to say, like, okay, I'm going to get what I need to sustain my life, and then I'm going to, for lack of a better term, vibe. Go do the thing that I want to do with my friends, with my family, create the social ecology that I need. And so, like, I view something like metagame and crypto at large as sort of helping us desegregate those two things, right? Because right now they're just opposites. If you are coming into this community and find the ability and interest in developing skills that are valuable and building community that others perceive as valuable, then it's an opportunity to share in that production and also to generate some of your, let's call it like cost of living, some or all of it, through the production that you create within that ecosystem. And maybe it's enough, maybe it's not, maybe it's augmentation, I don't know, but it's already starting to desegregate I go over here and I, sell my soul and do my job and play my minimum effort game. I take my paycheck home so that I can, cover my rent and buy food. And then I go have a life and engage in society. We can, at least in my opinion, those things don't need to be segregated to the degree that they are.
Can I circle back to one of the things that we were talking about when we were talking about tokenomics?
Yeah.
I wanted to bring it up then, but one of the hard parts about our system, and I know you were talking about like token voting. We don't do any kind of token voting.
I know.
Soft guard.
And how can we kind of separate more of the need for funding our basic stuff and the paycheck from everything, like the social aspect of it? I mean, should they be separated? Like, are they married?
I don't think they're totally separable. Yeah. So I mean, this is where I was getting at when I was starting to say mapping functions and value flows, because like there isn't gonna be, in my opinion, a like one size fits all answer here. Like in one hive, they're pretty tightly coupled in the sense that people get paid in honey, and the conviction voting algorithms which distribute funds to do work are paid in honey, and so there's definitely also like potential like sell pressure risks for people who are using those funds to cover expenses. But on the other hand, the engagement in decision making seems to work pretty well. It's a little bit tricky because the methodology doesn't require quite so large of a consensus. The barrier is relatively low to pass something, and then the Covenant and Celeste are there as a backstop to prevent somebody from just like coming in and saying, well, I have money, give me more money, which is like what we saw with that was it Uniswap lately had something like that happen. And anyway, so to go back to your question, I think that they are at least loosely coupled because it's the same organization, and you're never going to completely remove the fact that certain, let's call it decision-making power is going to be belonging to people who are the most engaged and the most involved and, are putting in the work to do strategic planning and write proposals. Like, you're not going to be able to eliminate that. We'll call it not so much centralization, but concentration, because it's pretty natural in organizations based on the amount of attention expended. So a smaller group of people extending a much larger amount of attention are going to be doing some degree of the steering, and then using a one person, one player, one vote, one, or again, mixing in some token-based mechanisms can include more people in this process. It could be done, as now it's mostly done in Discord based signaling, but it errs in the direction of people who are really active on Discord. Like I'll occasionally vote in something that I see pop up as a notification, but like I don't have enough involvement on a day-to-day basis to be tracking Discord closely enough. And I have a feeling that there are probably other people, probably people who are much more involved in other ways than I am, who don't necessarily, catch all of those. That's not bad in of itself. I'm just kind of like pointing it out that there's not a lot of, I don't think, not a lot of clarity about how and when and where the governance decision making gets made, and governance decision making is notoriously tricky. And so my probable first step would be to make player based voting a little bit more legible, just like easier for people to know when something's coming up, and maybe even even if you're using Discord for like signaling, anything that's a little bit more official gets a slightly slower process. And again, I know slowing friction can be a dirty word in designing for the web, but in fact it can help because it makes things a little bit easier to it makes it more legible, right? Like you might have posts in Discords with signaling, but then links, and you see proposals and you see snapshot voting. Some of the reasons this works is because it's usually slowed down a little bit. You see people posting announcements, hey, this is up, and here, read about it here, and here the vote's going to be open for this long. And although, a snapshot voting type structure has its own issues, I would argue that its big upside is that it has a relatively high degree of legibility, and there's actually nothing stopping someone like MetaGame from using snapshot voting against, a player NFT, like where you literally just you have your list, and maybe you give people the opportunity to go click the button and claim their NFT, and they claim it, and as long as you use that token as the voting token, you actually are going to get essentially one person, one vote. Though I'd be a little careful about doing that too naively, because you don't want to. There's transferability and the ability to generate it, but like with a little bit of effort, I suspect that you could maintain a whitelist that allowed people to mint themselves a non-transferable player token, and that on the flip side, you could, upon each say cycle, player cycle purge, do a single transaction paid by the DAO to do a cleanup, which burns all the the player tokens of the purge, and again, probably not mint all the new ones. You might want to still give people the task of coming and claiming to keep your gas costs down, but like that's still token voting, right? It's just that it's a one person one token scenario, and you can experiment with other types of mechanisms. But what I would generally advocate is that you design the process to what the decisions are over. So if you have things that make sense for that process and you test it out, that's great. If you have other types of decisions that make sense with a different process, then you can test it out. This is the main downfall of token-based systems, is the expectation that they're going to be one size fits all, rather than saying, like, what are we trying to decide? Who should be participating in that decision? How do we empower them to become informed? And then give them the relative ease of, again, knowing that there's a vote, becoming informed, then participating. And I think that if we think of that as the life cycle of a vote, you can imagine servicing some collective decision making as a binding factor across the growing community, because feeling and actually being engaged in decision making does affect outcomes. You just have to keep in mind, and this kind of goes to your point before, Penguin, not everybody wants to do that. You also shouldn't make them. You shouldn't be like, well, just because you didn't participate means that you're not invested. Maybe you're invested in a different way, because reading proposals and becoming informed and participating in voting is also a kind of work. And so you got to kind of figure out how to make sure that people aren't just being sort of devalued for not doing that. Sorry, that was kind of a long rant, but I'm with you in a lot of ways.
Is that good, Penguin?
Yeah, because I mean, one of the other things that I think is important and like worth saying is, as far as like metagame goes, token count really has almost no bearing except for the fact that we need to be able to vote to get more tokens minted. That's really the only reason that token matters. Like, honestly, you know, if someone needed to sell all their seeds every month, they would still be just as important and active of a player potentially.
Yeah.
For sure. Well, but
So
I
I,
think the question that was asked at the beginning related to that causing some issues for others, so like a tension between the stakeholders who want to see that token, stay constant or go up, which I'm sure you have some, and the people who want to that need to sell regularly. And I'm not trying to say that either of them are right or wrong. I'm actually trying to poke at what kinds of systems can be put in place to help, let's say, balance those forces out, or to like enable or support both stakeholder groups. And the first order thing to do is to create ways for the people who are needing to spend to do so in a manner that doesn't produce as much downward pressure, but still meets their needs for income.
yeah, sorry, there's another factor to that as well. So I think the part that I don't like about that is that anyone that has to sell loses the potential upside of when or if metagame does succeed. So like our our sweat equity is literally, the equity in metagame as well. So for you to take an income, you also have to completely like di- divert any kind of upside that metagame might have in the future. So not only
Yeah.
is it deflationary, but it also is like it really hurts the player in the long
Yeah,
run because
but be
you
careful, because you just described the other use case for a moment, right? Because you're talking about the upside, the sweat equity, the potential future value. So like these things are in tension because precisely because if you want that upside, you're envisioning a future where, again, however this thing takes hold, that the token value rises and that the person who is, you know, foregoing it, the short term for the long term potential upside, that is skewed in terms of who can do that. If I want to contribute meaningfully to a project and have exposure to its future success through a token going up, but I need to take time and effort and energy and attention to contribute, now I'm choosing to do that as in addition to whatever I'm doing to cover my living expenses. So like if I put myself in the shoes of the person who would be selling here, I have to be aware that they may not be able to take that risk or to trade off now for later, and later, even potential later. So think of it like at that point an investment, even if it's a sweat one. You can't. Not everyone gets the same starting point for making that kind of trade-off decision, and so it does actually lend itself to those who are more privileged. Maybe I have one of these, like, that, like, cushy, not all of them are cushy, but like say you have a cushy corporate job where you work 9 to 5, and it doesn't really draw on your main creative energies, and you go home and you jam on metagame and you keep all the seeds for the future because your day-to-day needs are fulfilled. But if you're someone who's coming into this creator economy looking for alternative ways to develop skills and to turn those skills into living expenses, and not that you don't want to be vested in the community, invested in the long-term outcome, but you just don't have the same optionality that other person has. And so part of the reason I think this needs to be dug at, and again, I'm not actually suggesting any particular answer. I'm actually just saying, can we figure out like who what these stakeholder categories are and what they need and what tooling we're deploying to meet the various needs of these people. Do you see what I mean?
oh, definitely, yeah. I mean, it's one of the big concerns that I have because I've been one of those people that's been forgoing a paycheck for 19 months now, So I'm not like, okay, now what the hell do I do for a paycheck, and how do I do? Because I don't want, I obviously can't just sell all of my tokens for all these communities that have been invested in. There's not even liquidity for it.
Right.
But like, I'm like trying to find a balance between supporting and engaging communities and being able to take income without being deflationary on that side as well. So I think there's both of those are extremely important use cases to consider. Is
So
the people
here's a thought though. Now I realize this is not something that you can teleport into, but like a kind of solution that would be sustainable would be one where metagame had a treasury management unit of some kind and some, power from the DAO given to them to do some degree of, let's just say, treasury management, maybe some things that are more or less risky in an attempt to maintain and even grow the holdings of the DAO, but that in addition to that, you maintained a P&L of, say, Rye, and you paid people, basically you compute their cred, and instead of paying just minting seeds, you sort of reduced the rate at which you minted seeds to the public, but you maybe increased the amount of seeds and ETH and Rye and whatever in the holdings of the DAO, and you basically said, okay, per period, you're going to pay people in, I don't know, say Rye, plus some minted seeds, so that they were getting a mixture of something that they could use to cover their expenses, and maybe you give people choices over like how to take it in, what mixture, but like you start to create some optionality across the compensation. But in order to do that, you still have to solve the net balance P&L, right? You can't pay with Rye you don't have. And so there's a tricky thing that emerges where you have to start to do some things that, traditional organizations do. And I don't just mean corporations. I mean, like, I was on the board of a nonprofit. We had to balance our P&L, right? We were literally just running, recreational sports leagues and youth outreach programs, but it didn't change the matter. We needed membership fees. We needed, people paid to play in the rec leagues. We had some donations, and we used it to fund youth outreach and education in the city. It was in Philadelphia. And so, point is that there was lots of different kinds of volunteer and even a little bit of paid labor that went into it. Lots of, things that were created by the organization were consumed, and people, paid for participation in the rec leagues, which created revenue, which could be spent to organize the things, maintain the fields, have relationships with the city, yada, yada, yada. And the point I'm trying to get at is that I don't think these DAOs are going to get away from eventually needing to, solve their version of the P&L problem. If you just mint and that's your only way of paying people, eventually you can basically inflate yourself too much. Like the likelihood that you can grow enough for, perpetual inflation to be the source of payment balance is questionable. I'm not saying we can't create value and that we can't sort of match that value with token minting, but part of the reason that we're having this discussion and we need integrations with things like Rye is that one way or another we need to be able to meet some sort of what I'll call sort of real world financial constraints for at least in the short term to medium term for a subset of contributors, like including yourself, Penguin. If we got to a point where you really did need to take a salary in order to pay your rent and buy your food, as opposed to maybe assuming that you've done okay in crypto markets and maybe you're drawing on something else that's more liquid in order to take care of yourself, like that's great until that resource pot is expunged, or until the process through which you're generating it is not something that you have the split time to do, right? And again, I'm not projecting precisely what you're doing. My point is that even for myself, I have to bucket between the things I do to make payroll at Blockscience and the things that I do to explore, research, invest either socially or financially in initiatives that I find interesting or care about.
I think you gave me like a great I really like the idea of the Rye token in there now, because now, like, if you withdraw a single asset for the stable coin, so obviously we need to get the revenue source income, but then that actually would support seed price, because you'd pay the fee to get the stable out, right? So you'd still be able to choose, do you want to take your payment in seed versus, so like if we paid people in the LP position,
So
right?
you would, that's interesting. So it would be a little bit mechanically intensive. I'm not sure how you'd want to implement it, but if you took all of the newly minted, like say you figure out how many new seeds you're going to mint, and then you deposit the seeds in the pool, then give people LP token shares proportional, then they could draw whatever they want. Keep in mind that the seed minting would still cause downward pressure at that point because you'd be adding seeds to the pool. But what would be interesting is if you could figure out how to produce revenue in Rye, you could actually add both,
Right.
or right, you could take that pool, the balancer pool thing, and if you
Mm-hmm.
could add, actually, here's an interesting thought. What if the amount of new
Well,
seeds that you created was proportional to your stablecoin revenue? And again, kind of future state. But if that were the case, then you could put newly minted seeds and DAO stablecoin revenues into the pool together. As a
I like it.
result, minting new LP tokens that are actually backed. They're not just minted out of thin air. Because they're matched with stablecoin or ETH or both revenues, then those new liquidity provider LP tokens that you're giving people are really just, you're giving them options. Literally, you're giving them options. They get the LP token, they can leave it. They can take it out in any one or in a mixture or in a proportional mixture of those currencies. The hard part about this idea is that in order to make it really economically balanced, you do need to produce a revenue in ETH and Rye, and you could maybe I don't know, simulate it, or in a sense, by starting off with your sort of historical funds. You have ETH. We've been talking about what to do with it. If you took some of that ETH and turned it into Rye, and then you had some ETH and some Rye, and you set maybe a 3-month period where you're gonna be sort of adding it in, but then the tricky part here is sort of rebalancing the way that you do seed minting, so that at each new time period you're saying, okay, some ETH, some Rye, some new seeds into the liquidity provider position, and then when people make their claims, they would be not making them on seeds. They'd actually be making them on those LP positions, and then it's up to them how to exercise that option.
I think that's the best solution that I've kind of heard yet. It's very similar to Olympus DAO, where they have all the liquidity and then people make bond requests from that liquidity, so they can just kind of pay you for yeah. I like that. I think that's the best idea,
It
because
would
then
be
if we
it
make
would be
partnerships with
cool,
Rye, then
but
we'd be
it
like,
would force you, just to be really clear though, you'll only have a runway based on however you schedule to spend your current reserves, because in a way that's your past revenue, your past inbounds. So it puts some urgency on figuring out how to generate future inbounds, either through treasury management or through any number of other revenue producing mechanisms. But that model will mean that if you can't produce revenue, you won't produce seeds, because
right.
you would be adding seeds proportional to, you'd be adding seeds in order to match your Rye and ETH revenue.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, yeah. I like that.
A lot of
It might be
answers.
hard for MetaGame to adopt, because, as you say, like, we'd have to either drain or get cash flow positive quick.
Right. Well, and look, it's in the reason I like it is because it has good incentive alignment, but it might not be a realistic as a next step. It might have to be something that you guys flesh out and work on and set some let's call them like trigger conditions, where you would say, look, like this could work really well, but it can't really start until we achieve blah. And then like start to use those, define and understand, collectively agree upon some transition conditions, and then work towards meeting those transition conditions.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful.
That's excellent.
For like my mental model.
That's really awesome. I've made notes on that as well and added it to the Figma, so that we have some of these thoughts in a place where we can consider them maybe at a later date than when we figured more of this stuff out. So yeah, I don't know. We've been going for like almost 2 hours, so I want to say obviously thank you for your time. If you do have any more time, I'm happy to like open the floor to questions from other players who are here who may want to ask specific things if they haven't been answered. If you have the
Sure,
time.
I can probably do maybe 20 minutes. I definitely want to do questions. I feel like I obviously talked a lot. I want to get people's thoughts and maybe provide answers if there are any. But yeah, I could probably do 20 minutes.
Okay, cool. So yeah, any questions from people who are here? Bagsy, Miss Amp, Dr. Lau.
Oh, I came in late, but I do have one question for Michael. I mean, you all produce and sort of run models. So how close are the models you operate match up to reality? Because I've done modeling myself, and usually you need to sort of close the gap. So in your experience, given that you've sort of done all this work on MetaGame and other things like that, how much of a gap is there between your conceptual initial models and what actually does happen?
It varies widely. Interestingly enough, I mean, modeling itself, scoping models, is highly subjective. So, depending on whether you're kind of going, whether you're early or have to go fast, you generally use more reduced models, and then you're looking for really like directionally correctness and less than sort of exactness. The longer that you have, the more time and the more iterations and the more data you can collect, the more precise you can build models. So I guess the short answer is models in general runs the gamut. It kind of depends on where you're at and what you're modeling.
Right. That sounds like the most important thing is to put in some sort of metric so you can correct the models.
Yeah, actually, I'll drop a link in the town hall dump to a Git book that we've been developing at Blockscience, it's called the Map of Computer-Aided Governance, and it attempts to it kind of attempts to. Actually, I'll pull it after. I don't want to try to talk and Google at the same time. It turns out I can't do that. But yeah, I'll just tell you. So it attempts to sort of contextualize the difference between sort of asking questions and just starting to like think about what you're trying to accomplish or questioning the data that you have, up to sort of mapping. A lot of what we've talked about today I would call mapping, meaning we're understanding the functions and the stakeholders and their relationships to each other, etc. And that's also modeling. It's not quantitative modeling, it's more sort of conceptual frameworks, but it's closer to sort of product and systems thinking type of methods. And then as you move towards more well-defined, well-posed questions with clear boundaries, you can start to make assumptions, decide what kind of simplifying assumptions are appropriate, and then use that context to build models, feed data into models, sort of make some sort of parameter fitting or projections or trend models. And coming from, I mean, technically my background is in robotics and control, like algorithmic decision making, and so one thing you learn is that like there's always a gap, to your point. And so what you do in any real application is build models, and models whose job is to essentially continuously monitor and validate and allow you to update your models. But that's usually like a really high test. Those are like critical infrastructures and stuff. And to a really real sense, crypto systems are becoming critical infrastructures, but as a rule, they don't get the treatment, the modeling treatment that physical critical infrastructures get. I'm hoping that will become more of a thing, but there's a lot you have to learn before you get to just modeling, because really scoping models, understanding mappings, understanding the relationship between the decisions and the assumptions and the there's just like a bunch of messy, very political stuff that actually comes down. It comes down to when you get to models that are of critical infrastructures, because you can't get away from some of the subjectivities that arise in methods, that arise in assumptions, that arise through particular data sources, in particular measurement, because your measurement always gives you one perspective. And if you don't have a kind of an understanding of what your measurement does and does not measure, it can actually be very difficult to build models that depend upon those measurements without introducing or even magnifying internal biases. So like modeling is epistemologically charged at the and politically charged at best. And so I tend to advocate that people undertake it with an understanding of its subjective elements. Otherwise, you see a lot of people treating models and even just data as naturally objective, and then arguing for things without acknowledging what that carries. And again, this is true of both data, because data collection methods tend to impose some sort of a priori ontology on the data. The data model itself and the mechanism for collecting it will affect what you observe. And then when you take that and in turn put it into various kinds of models, again, you're modeling assumptions, what's in and out of scope, what kind of processes or potentially behavioral assumptions you make, or how much you simplify or don't simplify the mechanisms. Because even in crypto, right, like you can take an approximation by looking at a system evolving month over month, hour over hour, block over block, or transaction sequence, including accounting for injection and reordering, which is where MEV comes from. So like that scoping of the analysis of the model will have a huge effect on what you can and can't see, what conclusions you do and don't come to. So like my real take on models is that like they're incredibly powerful tools, but they can be kind of dangerous in the hands of people who haven't taken the time to address the subjectivities that they introduce.
Cool. That sounds really fascinating.
Yeah, that was awesome. Awesome. Bagsy, Missanth, any questions quickly? Last like 15 minutes, if that. We'll draw things to a close, and thank you for your time. Honestly, there's so much gold in this, so I'm glad that we have this recorded and we'll be able to share this with the wider community, not just ourselves but the DAO space via our YouTube channel. So yeah, thank you for your time, and hopefully we get to end up working on some of the things we've spoken on here and getting those things completed so we can see what those things actually look like in reality once they're done. So I'm looking forward to that.
So just out of curiosity, what's the largest system you've worked on, Michael? I mean, I think MetaGame's what, a couple of thousand? So, I mean, how many real people are involved in the largest, working model you've been?
I don't know the number of people, but we've done a ton of work on Filecoin. So that's probably the biggest system. We've been working with the Filecoin team for, I guess, well over a year. We did some work on the actual the sort of design on the economic side. Actually, I mentioned earlier that one of my former students is an economics lead there. I kind of after he finished his master's, he kind of transitioned some of the more academic learnings into practice, and the Blockscience team collaborated closely with him and their team. We're continuing to do analysis and sort of work on developing tools for monitoring and models for sort of trying to maintain health in that ecosystem. And that's a pretty fucking big ecosystem. In fact, we have multiple maps and models where we're trying to do a better job orienting the different kinds of models against specific kinds of questions and specific decision-making challenges that arise. And actually, it kind of dovetails back into the computer-aided governance concept that I will post a link to the Git book once I find it in Town Hall Dump. Some of that is actually drawn from that experience. We're also doing work with Gitcoin. We have a relationship with ICF, which is the Interchain Foundation. So like currently touching a couple different ecosystems and really focused on the, for lack of a better term, the sort of interplay between the organizational components and the economic components in order to create these, sustainable, more ecological views of value production, whether it's the social, human labor, expertise, etc., or the computational labor, the sort of the validation, the checking, in the case of Filecoin, you're doing the storage mining proofs in order to demonstrate that you're either capable of or currently storing data. But the body of potential, let's say, productive work spans from participating in this sort of informing, sense-making, decision-making processes, all the way down to sort of low-level computational labor and maintaining the essentially DevOps, maintaining the infrastructure that actually runs those kinds of things. And for anybody who's not run a node in a blockchain, actually taking care of one and keeping it up can actually be work, maybe not a full-time job or anything, but it's not necessarily as simple as saying, oh, it just sits there and runs forever, especially in networks where there are penalties for failing to keep it up. So you do recurse to a human, even if that human is just responsible for monitoring and maintaining and doing some DevOps on a node.
Okay, great. Good question there, Dr. Lau. So, yeah, I think we'll draw everything to a close now. And obviously, like I said, thank you for your time. And I can't wait to share this with the rest of the community who couldn't make it today. And thank you for everybody who kind of did turn up and did want to hear this live and direct, because I think it's honestly there's been so much great conversation. So, yeah, I guess that's it, really. Thank you for your time, MZ, and Penguin for your questions, Dr. Lau for your questions, and everybody else who turned up. Bagsy, Miss Out, Xiao Leo. I'm not sure how to say that. But yeah, thank you for your time. So I'll be heading off now, and we'll draw this to a close.
It's great to see you, MZ. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I mean, this is my best and really like only practical way to be a contributor. So, I'm happy to kind of every so often hop in and try to do Q&A stuff. I'm enthusiastic. I'm
Awesome.
Obviously spread probably too thin in general, but I'm hopeful that I can provide some value, even if it's mostly through kind of rant sessions.
Yeah, make sure to give you props as well, and recommend that everyone go and give it some recognition as well.
We'll do.
Appreciate it. All right, I'll see you guys. Thanks for listening.
All right, take care then. Have a good rest of the weekend. Bye-bye.
Later.